You are listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.
The great Will Murray is one of the most prolific authors working today, having written more than 50 novels and short story collections, including tales featuring Sherlock Holmes, The Shadow, Doc Savage, and many more. He is a master of many genres and styles, and on this episode he joins Ahmed Khalifa to talk about his work in his latest book, Dark Avenger, The Strange Saga of the Shadow.
I read that you first discovered the shadow when you started listening to the Orson Welles radio shows, and then you started collecting the shadow pulps and the paperbacks along with Doc Savage. And it's obvious from your writing about the shadow and about Doc Savage, and your writing, you wrote fiction, and you write fiction about them as well, not just non-fiction, not just history, that these characters and this style of writing really appeals to you. So I want to understand what really attracts you to these kinds of characters and to pulp fiction in general.
I suspect part of it is growing up on DC and Marvel comics, and I liked those kind of heroes. And when I started to look for prose stories to read that were like that, Doc Savage was something I encountered. The Shadow started to be reprinted in paperback about a year after I read my first Doc Savage. No, the same year. And I was familiar with him not only from the radio reprints and the repeats in the early 60s, but there was a Shadow comic book I read, and there was one paperback I read that wasn't by Walter Gibson. And so when I encountered those characters, I think the appeal was the same appeal as the comic book superheroes I grew up on, but on a more realistic level, both in terms of the stories and in terms of the characters' abilities.
I think you mentioned, or maybe I read, that you are the executor of the Lester Dent estate, right?
The literary agent of the Lester Dent estate. Yes, since 1979, if I'm not mistaken. So for quite a number of years.
So how did that come about?
Well, I was visiting Mrs. Dent in 1978, 79, somewhere around there. And I had arranged the deal to get the lost Doc Savage novel into print, which was printed as The Red Spider. And I had suggested to Mrs. Dent, there's a lot of Lester Dent material that could be reprinted. And I don't know whether I volunteered or she suggested or her lawyer suggested, but I remember sitting in her kitchen table with her lawyer, Jim Valbracht, who is, I'm still in touch with, and her, and we hammered out an agreement where I would be the literary agent, and I would try to sell his stories and market them, which included, ultimately, we didn't know it at the time, but included, me writing new Doc Savage novels, because as the agent, I was able to cut a deal to use his unpublished outlines and manuscripts to write new Doc Savages. So it was on and off, while not super lucrative for anybody compared to mass market publishing. On the levels we were able to operate, I was able to give Mrs. Dent, who was on Social Security at that point in her life, an extra stream of income when it came in. I mean, sometimes a year or so would go by, we wouldn't sell anything, and then suddenly we would sell a bunch of things.
And how many Doc Savage novels have you written so far?
22 Docs and one Pet Savage.
And do you still find that there are corners of the mythology that you haven't explored?
Yes, I wouldn't say mythology, but after I wrote my last doc, I rediscovered an outline that for a published Doc Savage, that when I looked at it, and I said, Lester Dent just threw this away and wrote a completely different story around the same idea. This would make a great Doc Savage. I wish I had realized that when I was writing them. So in terms of the mythology, I always like to put Doc and his men in situations that maybe Lester Dent couldn't or didn't think about. And, you know, when I thought about things to do that Dent didn't do, well, there's never been a Doc Savage adventure set in Australia or India. You know, there have been Doc Savages set in New Zealand and in, you know, fictitious or semi-fictitious places near India. But those are two large countries that Doc has never set foot on. And there's got to be a story that fits those locales. But I never got around to that because I don't currently have a contract to write more Doc Savages.
Do you think that people who are working in the entertainment industry and the publishing industry, do you think they really understand and or value the contribution of characters like the Shadow and Doc Savage to popular culture? Because when I talk to people about, you know, trying to excite them and get them to read the original pulp novels of Lester Dent, and especially Walter B. Gibson, who's one of my favorite pulp writers of all time, I get the sense that people, you know, from different ages, not just the younger readers, but people from different ages who actually profess to be experts about popular culture and comic books and so on, they don't really know how much has been lifted from the mythology of the Shadow and the mythology of Doc Savage, like the Fortress of Solitude, for example, in later characters like the Batman and Superman and so on. So do you think there is some lack of understanding or knowledge about the contribution of these characters to popular culture?
Oh, absolutely. Because, you know, these stories were in their heyday, what, 70 and 80 years ago. And in paperback, Doc Savage was in his heyday in reprints in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. Even the 80s is a long time ago for some people. I mean, these were very popular characters. The New York Times columnist Russell Baker once made a list of what he called Americana that doesn't exist anymore. And he named things like the Saturday Evening Post, Doc Savage, and the Shadow magazine. He thought they were central to what Americans were about in Once Upon a Time. And you can't expect in a world with so much media and so many new authors and so many new characters, the Stephen Kings and the Dean R. Kuntzes and you name it. You can't expect everybody to know about this. I've written about it extensively, but not necessarily in the mass market. You'll find this information on the web. People will do columns about it and stuff, and that's interesting. But it's not. It's not central to what's going on now and what's been going on for a while. I mean, the Shadow is well known. Doc Savage not so well known, but Doc Savage was more popular with readers, just not more popular with what's the word for it? General.
Do you think there is
the general
some
audience.
reticence on the part of people who are working in the entertainment industry, comic books, maybe who people who write comic books, comic book artists and screenwriters and so on, to admit the influence of these characters and this style of writing on their work?
Well, I think if people were those who are willing to cite their interests, their influences, I'm sure they would admit it, but many don't have those influences. I think we have to understand these characters have become rather dated, even if the stories are still compelling. And, you know, they're of interest today the way Sherlock Holmes is of interest and Dracula's interest. People still read the Sherlock Holmes stories, but not necessarily in the numbers they used to, but there's still an appeal. There's always an appeal with retro fiction or fiction set in the past, but it's a narrower appeal for the average person who wants to turn on the TV or read a book and read about people today who think like people today and have the experiences of people today. But I don't know, I've been around a long time. So there's been a lot of waves of media writers, directors, actors, screenwriters who've come along. And, 30 years ago, a lot of people would point to Doc Savage as a thing that should be in cartoons and movies and TV shows. That may be less true now because the generations that have grown up on Marvel comics and DC comics and Star Wars and Star Trek, those are their touchstones. Remember that the paperback industry stopped reprinting Tarzan, Doc Savage, and many things like that around 1990 when conglomerates bought the major publishers and said we must only publish bestsellers going forward. So, Doc Savage ceased in paperback. The Destroyer temporarily ceased and was revived by a Canadian publisher. And you don't see Tarzan or Edgar Rice Burroughs books or old pulp stories and reprints in paperback anymore, with rare exceptions such as H.P. Lovecraft. They were always reliable sellers, but the new publishers wanted hits, big hits, whereas in the traditional publishers pre-1990, they understood that the millions of copies that they sold of Doc Savage provided the profits that they could pay and subsidize new writers who would become the blockbuster writers of the future. So it's a different business model.
Do you think that ebooks can fill the gap left by paperbacks in terms of presenting and making available these older books and these pulp novels and these characters?
Absolutely. I'm not sure why it hasn't been done, but absolutely, you could put every Doc Savage and Shadow on Amazon Kindle and whatever, Nook and whatever else as an ebook, and I'm sure there would be a steady sale. My Doc Savage ebooks are, still selling, not as they were when they were new. They never sell as well as when they're new, but certainly I noticed this in my books. My first Doc Savage was Python Island in 1990, but my first new Doc Savage was The Desert Demons, which was published in 2011. And that's the book I list as number one in the series, even though it wasn't number one because we didn't start reprinting my old Doc Savages until later. That's still my bestseller simply because it has a number one on it. People perceive that as the beginning of the series, even though it's not a first book in terms of the chronology of the characters. And it remains my bestseller because it's an entry-level book. People will usually order that first. And if they like it, they keep buying and keep reading. So I know from my own experiences with ebooks and trade paperbacks that there are always new people discovering Doc Savage, and that I would assume there'd be new people discovering the Shadow if there were Shadow ebooks.
But my first access to a complete Shadow novel was through the Black Mask website.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Because they had, I can't remember, I think they had almost most of the Shadow novels for free. You could read them online. And it was just an eye-opening experience to me because at that time, my only exposure to the Shadow was through the Alec Baldwin movie, which I went to see in theaters when it came out. I was just a kid.
Right.
But I was blown away by the character. And since then, the only way I can get my hands on a Shadow novel is through friends who have copies from around the world, or by finding online copies that are reasonably priced of the Belmont reprints. So it's still hard to find Shadow novels and Doc Savage novels, of course, other than the Doc Savage novels that you wrote, which are available. But do you think that situation will change in the near future in terms of the older paperbacks, the original ones?
Well, I suspect not, but I would hope otherwise. As you know, Condé Nast has licensed Doc Savage and The Shadow in new novels, updated novels through James Patterson. And I think there's a feeling that for those characters to be viable, especially to transfer into media, they need to be updated. And I can't disagree with that, because the generations that are coming up now won't watch old black and white movies, and they're becoming less and less sympathetic to, books or movies that take place in their grandparents' or great-grandparents' time. The thing I always comment on is, in an old movie or a novel, if someone is driving around and needs to make a telephone call, they got to pull into a pharmacy and go to a phone booth. Well, we drive around with our phones in our pockets and a private number that's unique to us. And I think that's, and there are no computers back then, and cars were different, and planes were slower. And I just think, just as a previous generation became disenchanted with the Western because they couldn't relate to riding around on horses, firing 6 guns when there were machine guns, available. I just think it's hard. I think it's a narrower group of people who can get into the mindset that says, I can read a Sherlock Holmes or a Shadow novel because I get that time period. I understand that time period. I understand its limitations. And it's interesting to see how these characters were in those days. So I think not, but as you said, if there were only ebooks, we would find out pretty damn quick.
But I just want to add, a few comments from the perspective of someone like me, because I wasn't born in the United States. I wasn't born in an English-speaking country, and definitely, I was born in the 80s, so I had no connection whatsoever to the era of the Great Depression and the era that these books came from. But regardless of, or in spite of the language barrier, in spite of the so-called cultural barrier, when I read these books and when I watched the movie, I just fell in love with them, to be honest. It's just the things that some people think, some maybe, I don't know, people in the business, I mean, who make these business decisions, think are barriers. They aren't really, because that's why I have a lot of problems with the current cultural mood swing that we are going through, because I don't really believe in the idea of that you need to come from a certain background or a certain era or whatever in order to appreciate the older stuff, maybe the Victorian literature, the Sherlock Holmes, the Shadow, the pulps, the Americana, all that stuff. I love all that stuff, and of course I later on I got to live abroad and I got to travel the world, but that was after I fell in love with these books and after I fell in love with these genres. So I think that people who are working in this business, I'm not talking about the creatives, of course, I'm talking about the business people.
Yeah,
they don't really understand that when you fall in love with a genre, or when you fall in love with a certain type of fiction, it's just love, It's just you fall in love with something, and these barriers are transcended by the imagination.
Yes, they
are just And I always give myself as an example because you know, I was born in Egypt and I grew up in Egypt. The first time I started traveling, I was in my teens, and then I studied in London when I was in my 20s in the UK. But before all that, I actually chose, you know, as someone who was living in Egypt, I actually chose these pieces of fiction. I actually chose them, and I read them, and I collected them, and it never even crossed my mind the things that people think would be barriers.
Mhm.
So imagine me as an example, and then imagine someone who is actually born in the United States or born in an English-speaking country. The barriers would be much, much, much less when they are being exposed to these books, even if they are younger readers or whatever. So I think these barriers, although they exist, I understand the business reality of it, but they don't exist as much as people think.
Well, there's another side to this. And the side is, for many years, let's look at the history of Doc Savage and the Shadow in media the last 50 years. There's almost nothing there. There was a flop Doc Savage movie and a somewhat disappointing Shadow movie. When I say disappointing, it didn't do well enough to spawn sequels, which was the plan. And I have heard anecdotally that various people in the animation business have floated Shadow or Doc Savage TV programs, and Condé Nast wants too much money for their budget, you know. And one of the things that happened inadvertently, you know, Condé Nast has every right to say this is our price. They're a big company. They're used to making a lot of money, but they priced themselves out of certain media like TV shows and animation. And the unfortunate side effect of that, which could not have been foreseen, is the fact that when they were like holding up the Shadow as, we need $1 million if you want to do a Shadow cartoon, DC and Marvel Comics were saying, you want to pay $200,000? Sure, let's do that deal. And consequently, we had Spider-Man cartoons and Batman cartoons and Superman cartoons and X-Men cartoons and you name it. This put those characters before a lot more eyeballs than comic books or any other kind of book, and consequently increased the value of those properties because they were exposed to people at formative ages. And so when there were Spider-Man movies, people knew who Spider-Man was. You didn't have to sell the character. They saw him on TV growing up. The last several generations have not seen the Shadow or Doc Savage on their TV screen on any level except repeats of the two movies. And of course, I did a Doc Savage radio script with Roger Rittner in the 1980s, but that was radio. It doesn't really have a huge impact. So what happened is that characters that were less popular, less significant, but more modern, such as Spider-Man, such as Batman, and others, have become, you know, major cultural and corporate icons, whereas Doc and the Shadow have receded into the background and into the past because they weren't exploited as much. So they're handicapped in terms of someone wanting to mount a Doc Savage movie or a Shadow film because there's the brand recognition is not as strong as it might have been 30 or 40 years ago, and certainly not as strong as it might have been in the 30s or 40s when those magazines sold well. So it's an unfortunate side effect of Condé Nast saying, you know, we don't want to do a deal unless we get a price that we feel is worth our effort. Because, you know, there's always the risk if you sell somebody a property and they mangle it, such as was done with Doc Savage, that it kills the property for the next filmmaker who comes along who might not mangle the property. So, you know, when they put a high price on it, it's to make sure that the party is serious and will follow through. So it's a two-edged sword. But the unfortunate side effect is that Marvel and DC characters are now major motion picture properties, and other kinds of properties, toy, video game, whatever properties. And Dark and the Shadow are a hard sell because they're seen as part of relics of the past when they didn't have to be. They could have been updated long before. They could have been marketed much more. Well, it's always a risk. I'm not criticizing Condé Nast because, as I say, if you lower the bar just to get something on the TV screen, you might end up with a mess. It's always a gamble.
Yeah, I actually I agree with you, and maybe the way to go, and of course it's all wishful thinking. Now we are just hoping for the best. I think maybe podcasts would be the way to go, because podcasts seem to appeal to younger audiences. And the same thing happened with the Batman, the animated series that Bruce Timm co-created, because they were trying to get it back in one form or another, but it's not really happening. So they decided to do a podcast that would be a continuation of the series with Kevin Conroy as the, to come back as the voice of Batman, Bruce Wayne. I don't know if that's still on, because of course, sadly, we lost Kevin Conroy. Maybe the Shadow could be done as a podcast written by people who actually understand the character and who would set it in the original timeline or in the original era. And maybe that would be it. What do you think of that? It's basically an audio drama like they did with Batman. There are, I think, 2 Batman dramas now on Spotify, or one, I can't remember. They can do something similar with the Shadow and Doc Savage, and I think and because I've dabbled a bit, with and I know people who produce podcasts, and I try to keep abreast of things when it comes to radio and podcasts and things of that nature, because I just love radio and I love the idea of podcasts and drama podcasts. And I know that, of course, there's tons of money to be made with podcasts now, especially, drama podcasts or audio dramas, because they are very cheap to produce. And with an established property like The Shadow, which, of course, I know it's not, of course, the Shadow isn't as popular, or Doc Savage isn't as popular or well known as something from DC or Marvel, but it is a cheap way and an almost risk-free way of doing it, to introduce it to young adults and people in the quote-unquote, desirable age bracket when it comes to making money.
I think it's a worthwhile experiment. I think the problem is Condé Nast is now invested in the new versions of the characters, the updated versions. They may not want the old versions out there, but they may. I don't know. I would say that I think it would be great if these characters could be perpetuated as they originally were for the audience that would have an appeal. And I've been saying for a few years now, we're more than a dozen years into major superhero motion pictures. Everything cycles in Hollywood. If superhero fatigue should start to creep in, what's the alternative? Well, maybe characters who are super heroic but don't have incredible powers might be the next potential wave, because the Western is dead, private eye stories are outdated, and a lot of other genres, come and go and aren't that strong. But Doc Savage, Indiana Jones is about to become another motion picture, and that's a pulp kind of hero. He doesn't have any abilities that are extraordinary, but he's an extraordinary individual in terms of the adventures he has. So I would not be shocked if at some point people are looking around in the media business. What can we do that's like superheroes, but they don't have, powers, because people are getting tired of that? Well, Doc and the Shadow and Indiana Jones and several other, James Bond is another example. People who have the ability to have go through adventures that are on the scale of superhero movies, but who aren't particularly superhuman.
Before we move on, the last thing I just want to follow up on what you're saying is I read the James Patterson version of the Shadow, and of course I haven't read the Doc Savage one, and I probably won't, because it's the same co-writer. It's James Patterson and someone else, and of course their approach. I don't want to say anything bad, because actually I think that James Patterson wrote a lot of entertaining books, and I go back to many of his books. I like some of his books and some of his style, and he has contributed, I think, a ton to actually getting people to read. People don't give him enough credit in terms of how many people actually fell in love with reading through James Patterson. So I give him credit for that, and I love many. I just read one of his books recently. So I don't like all of his stuff, but I give him credit, and I do like some of his stuff. But his take on the Shadow was just vanilla. It was just a bland kind of middle of the road take. That I personally, as a fan of the Shadow, of course, that's a given. I didn't really appreciate, but also from the feedback I got from people whose first exposure to the Shadow was through the Patterson novel, it failed to do what it was supposed to do. It didn't really make people fall in love with the character at all. So I don't think the updated way is working, at least in the way that it has been done now. So that's one thing I want to talk about. And also, that's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing, following up on what you were saying, and the idea of the need, some Condé Nast and some of these studios think that the updating is the way to go. We need to keep in mind something like Perry Mason, for example, on HBO, which wasn't updated and was very successful.
I want to say that updating these characters is a good idea, but it's the execution that makes it work or not work. And from the feedback I've heard, the execution has fallen short, which is very unfortunate. But I think the choices made are commercial choices and not creative choices here. And I don't see the Shadow as a science fiction character. Doc Savage might have fit that storyline better because he is a science fiction character. But the worrisome thing about the Patterson Shadow novel is every first book is, or should, get the audience eager for the second book, and the second book would sell the third book as well as the first book for those who haven't discovered the first book yet, and on and on. And this is at least a 3-book series, if not more. And if as many people were disappointed as I've heard and you've heard, that's worrisome in terms of sales for the second book and the third book. But of course, the second book can turn a corner and, raise the bar. I just don't know, whether it will or not, because the premise is what it is. They can't change the premise at this point. And I think a lot of people didn't care for the premise, didn't feel the Shadow fit into that kind of story, which I can't argue with because I have to agree with it. It's a difficult fit for the Shadow. The Doc Savage, I've barely read any reviews. That seems to be better received, at least as of the first week. I haven't seen a review since the first week, but I'm not hearing the extreme negativity about the Doc Savage novel that I heard about the Shadow novel, but I haven't been keeping up either.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I might give it a go later on, but we'll see.
The sense I have is it's better executed.
Yeah, maybe because in the Patterson Shadow novel there was an over-reliance on fantasy and science fiction elements, and there wasn't really, you didn't get the sense that the people behind the book did their homework when you know they didn't really understand the mythology of the character. It was just like someone who had listened to a couple of radio shows maybe, and who had like a very casual kind of you know, acquaintance with the character, but because they didn't really focus on any of the things that made the shadow so special, it wasn't really understandable for someone going in, you know, reading about the character for the first time, what the fuss was about, because he was just another kind of, he was like Bruce Wayne, and you know, it was just the concept wasn't very clear. But anyway, I want to talk about your work because I like your work much better. So I want to talk about your books, and I want to talk about Doc Savage, the Sinister Shadow, which I enjoyed so much. And I just wanted to, because you talk about how you went about writing it a little bit, you know, in the end of the book. But for people who don't know what I'm talking about, the Sinister Shadow, or Doc Savage, the Sinister Shadow, is an official continuation for both characters. And I don't want to give away anything of the plot, but basically in that novel, a situation comes about and a villain surfaces that forces Doc Savage and the Shadow to join forces and try to combat that villain, the funeral director. I just want to mention to you that there is a scene which takes place in that book, takes place in the Shadow's sanctum, or the Shadow's lair, in which the Shadow comes face to face with Doc Savage and a battle takes place. And I just want to say that that scene alone is worth the price of admission.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
That scene is just, if you are a fan of the two characters, it's just, that scene is just so well thought out and so well written and so mysterious. There's so much mystery, and because I know that the two characters are very different, and the writing style of Lester Dent and Walter B. Gibson, the writing styles were very different. Just to pull off that scene, that action scene, for fans was just amazing. To me, that really sums up what the book achieves. So I want to ask you how you, because I know that you are a fan of both characters and both writers, how did you go about trying to maybe outline or come up with a concept that would make this idea of a Doc Savage, the Shadow crossover actually feasible to do?
Well, I've had a general idea involving some of these characters going back to my Bantam Books days with Doc Savage, because I thought after a few years of Doc Savage, like, we could get the rights to do the Shadow and do a crossover. So I had a rough idea. And when I got to the point where I was able to get the Shadow rights, one of the first things I did is I acquired a copy of the carbon of Lester Dent's only Shadow novel, The Golden Vulture. And I was surprised and excited to discover there was a draft that I didn't know about that was radically different and full of wonderful scenes with the Shadow. And I said, this is great stuff. Maybe I can incorporate some of those scenes into my book. So I kind of built my plot. I didn't outline the book. I just created the premise. I kind of built my plot around that draft in part because I wanted to salvage those scenes, and I knew it would lend authenticity to the story if some of the chapters were actually by Lester Dent. And it wasn't hard to change the Golden Vulture into the funeral director. And one of the things that impressed me is that Lester Dent gave the Shadow all these gadgets that not only the Shadow never had in the regular novels, but Doc Savage never had. And I said, why didn't they use some of these in Doc Savage? These are good ideas. So I built it around. So there's something like 22 chapters in this book that are essentially me polishing the Lester Dent. And it was a wonderful miracle because it enabled me to write the book much quicker. It enabled me to get into the Lester Dent writing style, and it enabled me to write with a 1933, 34 sensibility because this story was written in 32. And I was introduced to Walter Gibson's shadow novels through Bantam Books. So that was the first three, and then a smattering of the others. So I was always interested in that early shadow that lived in this gritty early Depression New York with its early Depression underworld. So this Doc Savage novel is more or less set in the Shadows world, which is why some people say it reads more like a shadow novel than a Doc Savage novel. Well, it's Doc Savage operating in the Walter B. Gibson milieu that was created in 1931 and 32. And I just love that, and so I was able to, salvage some material that would never see the light of day and do something that was unique. Not only was this a unique meeting of Doc and the Shadow, but the Shadow was doing things he didn't do in his own magazine, having gadgets and devices and such.
As a fan of the Shadow and as someone who read a lot of Shadow novels, when I was reading it, I think the best say I can say about your book is that, of course, it was a bit difficult to understand when exactly was your novel set in the Shadow timeline, but I guessed it was a bit early because there was still talk of the radio show. So I guess you placed it earlier in the Shadow timeline, right?
It's in 1933. So it would, because Doc is operating as a public figure, it has to be 1933. So it's 1933 for both of those characters.
Yeah, and the best thing I can say was that since I wasn't really sure of the timeline, there were scenes in the book and instances in the book that I thought, well, is Will gonna unmask the Shadow finally? Is this going to be the final adventure for the Shadow? Because you push him so much, you put him so much through the ringer, and Doc Savage gives him a run for his money, basically. So by the last third of the book, you begin to wonder, is this gonna be the last Shadow adventure? And then, of course, things happen, and I don't want to give it away, but just I love the way you tied things up, and the way the characters come to somewhat of an understanding by the end of the book. And I think it's just terrific entertainment. And the best thing also, or I guess there are many best, quote unquote, best things I can say about the book, but I think one of the also very appealing things about your book, Doc Savage, The Sinister Shadow, is that the thing that your book pulls off, it pulls off something that I think is very difficult, is that even for someone who is new to both characters, because when I read your book, I was new to Doc Savage, I wasn't that familiar with his mythology, you can get into the book and it serves as a very good introduction to both of them, both of the characters. So you
yes, that's because it's early in their career and they're still getting started, the Doc more than the Shadow. But I did a very early version of Doc Savage where he's essentially still new on the scene. And that enables the reader to sort of acquaint himself with the character without the need of a lot of backstory.
Yeah, so I really think that since the book is readily available and is much easier to get than the original Shadow novels, I think if someone wants to get introduced to Doc Savage or the Shadow, I think your book, Doc Savage, The Sinister Shadow, is just the perfect introduction. So I just wanted to say that, and how much I enjoyed your book. And are there any plans for you to write another book about the Shadow?
Well, I've just released my nonfiction book, my second nonfiction book in the last year and a half, the Dark Avenger, The Strange Saga of the Shadow. This is a rewrite and expansion of my 1980 book, The Duende History of the Shadow magazine, which I wrote in college. And I don't have any plans for Shadow novels. I would love to do another Dark where the Shadow is a character. But, you know, Dark Avenger is the more or less sequel or companion volume to last year's Master of Mystery, The Rise of the Shadow. Only this is a book covering the history of the character, more or less in the magazine, whereas Master of Mystery was a collection of articles and interviews about the Shadow in his radio and pulp and other incarnations. But yeah, you know, if I had the opportunity to write a Shadow novel, I would have to stop and think about what's worth doing, because the world doesn't need another Shadow novel of the type that Walter Gibson wrote, because he wrote so many, and there's a lot of them are great. What would interest readers would be a crossover of some kind, or a novel that has some what's the word for it? Something that makes it break out of the pack from just being, here's another Shadow novel.
I guess for readers who or for fans of the Shadow, the only, you know, venue or the only platform that they could get as many adventures as they could get their hands on was the comic books, the graphic novels by Matt Wagner and so on. They did the Dynamite Comics, I think, did a line featuring the Shadow. Some of them were better than others. Probably the Matt Wagner ones were the best. But I haven't, and of course, you know, you would know more than I do, because I haven't heard that there were any plans to actually release any new Shadow novels except the James Patterson ones.
No, I don't think that there's any plans along that line, because I think the investment is in updating these characters. One, because, you know, James Patterson sells books, and so the Condé Nast will make money, and the characters are introduced to a new generation or a new series of generations. But also, the long game is, you know, can these characters come into other media, such as films or TV? And I suspect the belief is, and I don't disagree with this, that the Shadow and Dark have a better shot at being major motion pictures if they're modernized. We'll see if that's what happens, because it's a very tricky business to mount a motion picture or a TV program or even an animated show, because there's a lot of competition out there. And everybody wants to interpret characters in a way that they think works. So that if someone says, let's do this James Patterson Shadow, but let's change it. And so, okay, then someone else is changing what's already been changed. And will that work? Will it appeal to an audience? You know, this is why I write books and not screenplays, because you can define an audience and you can say, I know what they want, I'll give it to them. Whereas if you're writing a screenplay, it's throwing darts. You know, you got to get the funding, you got to get the right director, the right talent, the right distribution, the right promotion for it to work or not work, or sort of work. I mean, that Shadow movie with Al Baldwin was a good movie. It wasn't a great movie. It didn't motivate anybody to say, let's do a sequel. But that was the plan, a series of Shadow films. It just didn't quite come off the way it could have come off, you know, in the way everybody hoped it would come off. And so we haven't had a Shadow film in 30 years. That's a long time. We have James Bond movies every so many years. Even when there's a drought, it's not more than 5 years, 4 years. It's sad. You know, Doc and the Shadow should be in their 20th and 30th films by now, or TV shows or whatever. And we're not seeing that. So, you know, the opportunity to keep these characters at the top of the cultural awareness peak, mountain, whatever, it has been lost through, you know, just misadventure and you know, mistimings and, you know, unfortunate, you know, circumstances, like your two best characters have been in 2 movies and both of them are disappointments. I mean, nobody controls that. It's just how it unfolded.
I want to touch upon quickly, because I don't want to take too much of your time, but because I know that you mentioned in our last conversation that you had a chance to visit the set when they were making the Shadow movie with Alec Baldwin. Did you get a sense of, because I like the director Russell Mulcahy, I think he did Highlander and he's a great visual stylist, but there are problems with the movie. So because you were on the set, did you see something, or when you were there, did you get a feel that something was off?
No, I thought it was going to be a hit movie, but the thing I noticed during shooting that explained to me one of the problems with the film is, if you'll recall the scene with the beryllium sphere rolling around and everybody sort of chasing it or trying to capture it, that was shot 3 ways: straight, comedic, and somewhere in between, semi-serious, semi-comedic. And the thing you have to understand about motion pictures, which is very critical, is the director is one thing, but the cutter is just as important. The person who cuts the footage together and makes it a movie, because, you know, if you film a scene several ways, the cutter has several choices. And a cutter is going to look at a scene from the standpoint of what's the best version of this scene. And, you know, and sometimes some versions don't work. An important thing in a movie is tone. And if in a Shadow movie, you would think the tone should be serious, but of course you can have it a little lighter too. You know, the Margot and Lamont relationship can be on the light side, and it had humor in it. Whoever cut that film cut it in a way that the tone was all over the place. It's serious in this scene, it's comedic in this scene, it's in the middle in that scene. And so what you have is a movie that doesn't know what its tone is, or even what its audience is. You know, one would expect at that time, and now anybody shooting a shadow film would include some humor, because that's the hallmark of everything from Indiana Jones to Marvel and DC movies. Well, maybe not DC movies so much, but, you know, people like a certain amount of humor, a little bit of tongue in cheek, as long as it doesn't go too far. So I think the problem with that film was not with the director or even how they shot it, it's how they cut it. And they cut it so it was a tonal mess. You know, it didn't take a tone and stay with it. You can have a serious tone with moments of humor, but the beryllium scene was a serious scene about a very dangerous situation. And as it was, the version we saw was almost slapstick. And that ruins a movie like that.
I got that feeling. Even I was just a kid, but I got the feeling that because that movie had some intense scenes, especially the ending. Yeah, the ending was just almost horrific, you know, with the mirrors shattering and basically the lobotomy that Shiwan Khan goes through. So, but yeah, I get your point, but I don't know. It's just a missed opportunity. But I just still love the movie. I just watched it.
It's a good movie. It's a good movie. It's just not a great movie. You know,
yeah. Before I let you go, I wanna just touch upon your Sherlock Holmes stories, because I recently discovered them. But because also I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan, and whenever I get a chance to read pastiches and talk to anyone who writes good Holmes stories, I have to ask him about it. So your stories are just fantastic. I read a couple of them. To be completely honest, reading your other work, because the style is very different, the pulp fiction style, because I've read a lot of your work, but when I read the Sherlock Holmes stories, it's just a completely different facet of your style. Because you write because you capture Conan Doyle's voice to a large degree, you capture the tone, you capture the mood, and I haven't met a lot of writers who grew up on pulp fiction and who love pulp fiction, who are that into, you know, the Victorian style of writing, especially the British, you know, style of writing that Conan Doyle did so well. So I was just, you know, your stories are so entertaining, and the recent one I read was The Gray Seal, and
Yes.
it actually introduced me, and it reintroduced me, because I knew about Jimmy Dale, the character Jimmy Dale, a little bit, but your story actually got me excited about rediscovering his work, because his work, the Frank Packard's work, who originated the character of the Gray Seal, Jimmy Dale, his work now is in the public domain, so you can get the books everywhere online.
Yes.
And your style is just it's just so entertaining, and they are so well written, as is all of your work. But I just wanna, you know, understand, because you have to be a very wide reader to be able to write pastiches of Lovecraft and Walter B. Gibson and Lester Dent and Arthur Conan Doyle.
Well, I don't know if that's wide reading, because, you know, Sherlock Holmes is almost, even if you're a pulp fan, it's almost impossible to not encounter Holmes on some level, even if you don't read too many of them. I pride myself in, when I write these characters, in writing them authentically, but also writing them in the style, to the degree I can, of the original author. To me, that's the challenge and the joy of doing it. And I'm glad, you know, it's funny, I've written for a lot of Sherlock Holmes anthologies, and I don't have time to read the anthologies I've contributed to. So I have no idea how well my stories stand up against other people's stories. I think you're the first person to say that they're credible, because I feel self-conscious as a 21st century, what century are we in? 21st century American, writing Victorian British stuff, because, you know, it's not my era, it's not my time. And I read Sherlock Holmes when I was younger, but I didn't really start to read him intensively until I started writing the stories. And then I immersed myself in them, and I think I do a decent job. I'm sure there are people who do much. I'm sure there are guys in Great Britain doing much better jobs, because they won't make some of the mistakes I have made, in terms of the fact they don't have sidewalks in Victorian London. They have a different word and other things. But I think my stories are good. I just don't always understand how good they might be in comparison to other people writing the same stuff.
You know, just I'm not a Sherlockian, of course, as is Mr. David Stewart Davies, who I spoke to twice. I interviewed him last year, and I just interviewed him a couple of days ago. He's one of the go-to authorities around the world when it comes to Holmes. But I am a huge fan, and I've read a wide range of stories, and I know my way around Conan Doyle's work. You know what a lot of writers of Holmes pastiches get wrong is that they tend to overdo the language a little bit, because they think that it's kind of a revisionist tendency, because they think that because Conan Doyle's stories took place during the Victorian era, and because of course it was written by a British writer, that his style was like Dickensian almost.
Okay.
And of course, Conan Doyle was not that kind of writer at all. Even Isaac Asimov called him a sloppy writer. And of course, I don't agree with Isaac Asimov. I don't agree with almost anything Asimov says. But I'm just this is just an extreme kind of opinion about Doyle, because Doyle was an amazing writer, Conan Doyle, and he was a stylist, but he was an unfussy writer. He wasn't really into flowery, Victorian prose. So what you get right is that you get the diction, and you get the tone, and of course you capture the flavor more or less of the time, but your stories are very readable. They are very, they are page turners and readable and believable in terms of the time period of them. And I read books by some of the best Sherlockians out there, and the best of them always capture the simplicity and the fluidity and the smoothness of Conan Doyle. Mm-hmm. The worst pastiches are always the ones written in a flowery way. So that's what I loved about your stories, and of course the idea of crossovers, which you seem to be a master at. And again, the problem with the crossovers usually is that it's capturing the tone, because one style or another usually just takes over. That's what I loved so much, especially about the Ring, about the.
Yes. I wrote 3, I think, John Silence Sherlock Holmes stories, but yes, I know that one. You're speaking of the. I don't remember the title. I've written. I'm just not my 40th Sherlock Holmes stories. I hope to have it done this week. But I didn't ever imagine I would write that many. I want to say this about the fact that I capture Conan Doyle, other than the fact that that's the part of my objective, to write like him and to write his character credibly. One of my secrets is my mother grew up in Ireland and came to this country when she was a teenager. And she spoke a brand of English that was, compatible with the English of the Victorian and post-Victorian times. And I think some of my ability to put words in the mouths of Victorian characters is because her speech and her diction, were things I was exposed to, obviously growing up. I also want to say that I'm working on my 2nd volume of The Wild Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. It probably won't be out till the end of 2023 because there are other books in front of it. But I'm culling out now what I consider to be the best of my previously published Sherlock Holmes stories. And the cover's been painted. And this book will probably be out by Christmas of next year.
I'm glad to hear that, and I'm actually going to grab a copy because I had it on my to-be-read list. Your book, the Wild Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is available on Amazon and other stores as an ebook, and they are just delightful. For someone who likes Sherlock Holmes, which might be a different audience than the people who like Doc Savage and The Shadow, because I think a lot of younger people and a lot of people in general who like The Shadow and Doc Savage tend to be, especially from my generation and maybe a little bit older and a little bit younger, tend to be people who read comic books.
Yeah,
because they get, they get the common ground and the mythology of these characters, the larger than life kind of vigilante superheroes, shtick. But I guess for the Sherlock Holmes audience is a bit different, and I really enjoy your work. And for people who like Sherlock Holmes stories and who, like me, finished the canon the canonical Holmes stories a long time ago, and are always looking for good pastiches. Your work is so super fun and very well crafted, and I look forward to reading all of your Sherlock Holmes stories.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. And it's really good to get that feedback because, as I say, I'm a little bit in the dark in terms of where my work ranks against the many other people also doing Sherlock Holmes stories these days.
The thing I enjoyed about your stories, again, is that they are very quick, on their feet, and you get the sense that you are having fun writing them.
Yeah, I enjoy writing them. I think it's great as a writer to step into the literary shoes of other writers and try to not only emulate their style, but their vocabulary, their point of view. I hate reading pastiches where someone has just twisted a character into what's comfortable for them to write, as opposed to what they should be writing. Occasionally, I'm asked to contribute to a Sherlock Holmes anthology that might be Sherlock Holmes in the multiverse or Sherlock Holmes steampunk. And I have difficulty wrapping my brain around trying to change Sherlock Holmes into something Conan Doyle never imagined. So I usually skip those anthology invitations because I just don't know that there's a point to do that. I have done a couple of stories. I did one recently. It's not published yet, where Sherlock Holmes encounters H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos elements, but I kept it more realistic than a typical H.P. Lovecraft story, because I think if you throw Sherlock Holmes into a full-blown Lovecraftian story, it just doesn't work as well, because he's not used to the fantastic. He's used to the seeming fantastic. And that story is called The Horror of the Drowned Souls. And that story will be in a forthcoming Belanger Books anthology, assuming they accept it, which I haven't heard officially, but the anthology was my idea, so I think they probably will accept it.
I know that you have the Dark Avenger coming out. I think it's already out, you say, right?
It's out in hardcover from our website, www.adventuresinbronze.com. And I just this morning received the soft cover from my designer and co-publisher, the tremendously talented Matt Mooring, and I'm going to be uploading that to Amazon today, tomorrow, or the next day, and punching out a proof. So it will be available on Amazon probably around the 1st, if not before. And so that book is and it will be available from my website as well. So that book is now about to be put to bed, and I'm very excited about it because it was a chance to take a book I wrote when I was very young and make it the best book it could be. So it's truly a monumental look at the Shadow magazine and the people and the forces that shaped it.
Yeah, I look forward to reading it because you mentioned it actually when we talked last year, when we were talking about Master of Mystery, your first nonfiction book about the Shadow. I've been waiting, for it ever since, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. And you also mentioned that you have an upcoming collection of your Sherlock Holmes stories. So anything else coming up?
Well, I've just released the second of the Wild Adventures of Cthulhu, collecting my H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos stories. And I have another Tarzan coming up probably in the spring, in which he goes back to Mars and meets John Carter of Mars. Beyond that, I'm thinking of a third Shadow book that will collect some of my miscellaneous articles on the Shadow, especially ones on the comic book versions of the character. And isn't that enough? That's a lot of books.
The last time we talked, I also talked about how prolific you are, and I have, because I've actually written 12 books so far, and I work in publishing, and I work with writers and screenwriters and so on. So I know how hard it is to actually be prolific. A lot of people don't get how hard it is to actually maintain the discipline, and how much discipline it actually requires to write not only so much but also so much of quality.
Maintaining the quality is key, because it's, you can get to the point where you can churn things out, but you got to be willing to polish and rewrite to keep the quality up. That's very important.
Yeah, and before I forget, because we were speaking about the dearth of people who mention the shadow in popular culture now, or in the past 50 years or whatever. One of my favorite Dean Koontz books is called From the Corner of His Eye. And in that book, there is this whole plot line about a person who just goes on this sort of walkabout, and he's a huge fan of the shadow. And he keeps mentioning the shadow and the shadow books, and I think the Shadow Radio Show, it's one of my favorite Dean Koontz books. It's one of his best. It's a big book, but it's an amazing book. And I was very surprised to actually read to read that Dean Koontz is actually a fan of the shadow.
Yeah. What's the title of the book?
From the Corner of His Eye. I think it was published 10 years ago or something. It's getting older now, but it's one of his absolute best books. And that whole storyline about the guy who goes on that walkabout is just so amazing and so heartwarming. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Dean Koontz for mentioning the shadow.
I'm glad you mentioned it, because I've never heard of that. And I thought everything that involved the shadow, someone would have mentioned it to me at some point. This is new to me, so that's very good.
Yeah. You can tell I'm a huge shadow fan. I never forget when someone pays tribute to the character. And I don't want to take any more of your time. You have been very, very generous with me with your time. The last conversation we had, you also gave me a lot of your time, and this time you've been even more generous. So I just want to thank you very, very much, Will, for speaking with me today, and I look forward to reading more of your work, and I hope you come back again and join me.
Oh, I'll be happy to come back, AK. I mean, I enjoyed this conversation as I did the last one. I like the title of your podcast. The Dark Fantastic is a great title. And anytime you want to talk about any of my many writing endeavors, I'm certainly happy to get on and go into it with you, because you ask some very intelligent questions and you're coming from a good place on these characters. So, anytime, just let me know.
The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The shadow knows.
Thanks for listening, and please join me again on another episode of the Dark Fantastic Podcast.
Death is a man in black, and he has gone insane, slaughtering the innocent. Only X, an amnesiac who wakes up to find his wife dead beside him, can stop him. Now, X, along with a band of heroes hunting the man in black, have to embark on a terrifying journey through the cursed town of Crofton and into a haunted house filled with secrets to find the only thing that can stop death. From A. Cale, the #1 best-selling author of Bad Dreams. Coffin X, a terrifying novel of dark fantasy and horror. Now available on Amazon.